get some coaching from Michael on accent. I
was just going to leave her in a bit more Yiddish, actually. That's what I was hoping to do, just spontaneously. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. I was just going to ask, one of the things that it says on the back of the book is that the family history is a very important inspiration for you and for this particular story. Do you want to tell us why?
Well, funnily enough, I didn't really realise it until I was quite a way into the book, because, and in fact, a friend of mine who had written a very successful family memoir, I remember driving the car with him, and he was asking what I was doing next, and I said this. He said, "Oh, I thought you'd do something about your family," and I was going, "No." And actually, of course, that was exactly what I was doing. But it was in a rather indirect way, because I thought I wasn't, because, well, my family didn't go to Spain. You know, what did they have to do with it? But actually, my grandparents were very active communists in London in the 1930s, and of course they couldn't help but be involved in Spain in that situation. And the more research I did, the more I ran into them. It started with where I knew I would find them, which was Cable Street, because I knew about Cable Street from my grandfather's descriptions of it. He was a solicitor, and his job in demonstrations always was to stay out of trouble so he could get everybody else out of prison afterwards. And in fact, it was something else that only came back to me when I was talking to my wonderful publishers, Hotkey, about the book, and I suddenly remembered this conversation that I'd had with my granny, who was and I knew her as this lovely, romantic, sort of revolutionary type, and whenever it was her birthday, I'd say, "What would you like?" and she'd ask me to learn a poem, and I remember her telling me one day the reason why it was so important to learn poetry by heart was in case you ever found yourself in prison, and you didn't have anything to read, and you know. She seemed not the criminal type, and I asked her more about it. It turned out that she'd been, it was Spanish Civil War demonstrations. And then I remember now, I think, oh, I'm such an idiot, I got so distracted, because I then found out that she'd known Esmond Romilly. I'd just been reading the Mitfords. I was absolutely thrilled and thought, how marvellous, you know, but of course also didn't want to press her, because although Romilly didn't die and he died in the Second World War rather than the Spanish Civil War, but it, you know, at that age, it's hard to talk to grandparents about friends that you know have died, and of course now there are hundreds of questions I wish I'd asked both of them. And I did go back and listen to my grandfather in the Imperial War Museum archives, which was a big source for me. And then I kept running into them in other bits of Lila Berg's autobiography, Flicker book. She joins the party and goes to meets my grandparents, and I had two other great aunts on both sides in the Communist Party as well. One of whom was in prison, was arrested for throwing a brick through the German embassy's window, and so on. And then all these stories started coming back to my memory, and that I sort of it's been quite strange, and that's really been more recently. The Spanish Civil War demonstration that I remember my grandmother talking about was all arranged after, it was Piccadilly Circus, and they just had a time as the theatres were coming out and everybody stepped out into the road and blocked the whole of Piccadilly Circus, and then they were all arrested, and then my grandfather went to Vine Street and bailed out my grandmother, and then she told him who else was down there, and gradually he bailed out one person after another. Until I think he got 40 politicals out, and then the policeman said, "Oh, do you want to go down to the cells and see if there's anyone else there, you know?" And I think there were a couple of prostitutes in the pickpocket. But so yes, when I started doing the research, it all felt very familiar, and the songs particularly.
And what about because you mentioned the songs there, but I was also thinking there's some very striking kind of anecdote images in there, like the ones that, sort of gave me a sense of not quite being there, but it was very evocative, the moment, for example, with all the books being thrown out of the bags, and as the soldiers with their idealism suddenly find they actually have to cross and do some fit walking, and then they have to throw out all their burdens.
Dialectics of Marxism.
Yeah.
Well, that was a great example actually of how how I worked on the book, which was is really embedded in volunteers' accounts. And I suppose what I wanted to do was the kind of accounts that I think a young person won't have access to because I'll have to plough through all the other material. You can just, in fiction, you can pick the highlights. It's just, you know, it feels almost cheeky, but I was able to weave together a whole load of different people's stories. And that particular story, which was one of my favourites and really struck me when I read it, was an unpublished memoir by a volunteer called David Crook, who actually ended up in China. And in fact, I met his son this year, which was wonderful. And his family were all very pleased that, you know, he was suddenly featuring in this book, which was nice. But it was just such a striking image. These books, as they went up the hillside, the dewy hillside into Harama, they were literally having to discard the weight of, and the books that they talked about, it was all poetry and Shakespeare and Marxism, which, you know, was, but I'm sure also probably quite symbolic as well.
Yeah, no, wonderful. I thought that was a really interesting episode, but there were quite a lot of other images, like the ambulances. What made you choose the kind of topic of the medical aspect, following the nurse? Why did you choose a nurse as a figure? There were two things, really. I'd been working in history of medicine before this, so it was a sort of something I was interested in already. I'd been working on 18th century things, and so I was kind of used to hanging out at the Welcome and so on. And I knew I wanted a strong woman character. I was really hoping there would have been that there were British doctors, but of course it was very early, and in fact there were a few. I think there was definitely a Polish doctor there, but I had to settle for a nurse. I felt it wasn't my first choice, if you sort of mean, but that's what I wanted to do. And then, of course, once I discovered more about medicine and the Spanish Civil War, it was just an absolute gift of theme, because there were lots of innovations in medicine, really important ones, and the most important one was blood donations, and it was a system of mobile blood transfusions, so that instead of the wounded patients being brought back from the battlefield and suffering as they were taken to the rearguard hospitals, the blood was collected in Madrid or Barcelona or anywhere and taken to the frontline hospitals and administered as quickly as possible, and that made a massive difference to recovery rates, not sadly in the section that we just read out, sorry Ben. But it was also such an extraordinarily potent image, because we were talking about people who really were prepared to sacrifice everything for the cause. And they were literally giving their blood, and particularly writing at a time when vampires were so in, and then I would read in young adult fiction, and then I read accounts where nurses described themselves as vampires because they would fall on ambulance drivers and beg them for blood. And they would also literally do arm-to-arm transfusions when they ran out of bottled blood. If they needed blood for a patient, they would sit down by the bed and have a tube going from their arm into the patient's arm. And, you know, what more can you give, really? So, you know, it was a riposte to the vampire theme, but it was also just the most extraordinarily powerful image I found. And once I'd, you know, that was very early on in the process, and once I'd got that, I couldn't really stop. So was Felix the first character that came to you, or did you always have a sense of Felix and George and Nat?
I think I always did think it was going to be three. Partly because I'm greedy and I wanted it to. One of the reasons why I write books or make radio programs or whatever I do is because I just want to find out more about whatever it is, and so that meant I could find out about nursing, I could find out about the soldiers, and I could get in journalism, which and I'd read Paul Preston's wonderful book called We Saw Spain Die, which is all about the journalists who covered the Spanish Civil War, on both sides in fact. And it was so powerful and so fascinating, and that was how I discovered Arturo Barria and all the other people who worked in that whole field. And also, as I then realised that propaganda was such an important development in the Spanish Civil War, and it was you know, because it was a battle for hearts and minds as much as it was anything, then it felt a very important and unexplored way into the war.
Yes, what's striking with these particular characters, and well, because we're privileged, we've managed to actually read it, you're going to have to wait for it, but what is really interesting about these particular characters is how they're all, it seems to me, they all kind of arrive with their own different motivations in Spain and become involved in the different ways. And what I find really striking about George in particular is how he goes across with a particular mission in mind, which is to rescue Felix, but then becomes involved in the journalism, but has many kind of personal crises of his own when facing, well, when basically having to deal with the fact that he has to write in particular ways about the war, and yet what he's actually having to see as well and dealing with that. So he really struck me as quite a complex character.
Yes, I think George was the one I probably fell most in love with quickest, and I think he's a character that older readers tend to go for as well. I think he probably has more appeal for maybe us more jaded creatures. I don't know, but he. I think I wanted to use him in a way, maybe I wasn't conscious of this at the time, but there was an unspeakability about it, as there still is in Spain now. I think it was such, and also there's such the same, you know, because of all this unfinished business. I wanted him to express the idea that there are some things you just can't say, there are some things you can't understand, that you can't comprehend about war, and particularly a war like that where it is, you know, I mean, a civil war is the worst kind of war, really, where it's family against family and village against village, and of course it means that you go on living with the consequences for generations afterwards. But George is the real mensch, I think, in the story.
And do you want to tell us a little bit about you know, the difficulties of writing about war for young readers? Do you find it is a complex issue because of the potential age of the readers, or do you find, well, that doesn't have any bearing on it? I view this as a work of fiction, so the age of the audience isn't something I'm taking into account?
No, I was very much taking into account, and I think there are very specific issues to do with the Spanish Civil War. I mean, there are issues to do with writing about war for children generally. I think there are very specific issues with the Spanish Civil War because it's so little known about, and the funny thing about it is the more you know about it, the more you realise how incredibly complicated it is, and the more complex it becomes. And so what I wanted to do with it really was write a book that was completely accessible to anyone who knew absolutely nothing, and that they would be swept along by the story and by the narrative of it. But I hope it's a book that people will go back and read with other knowledge when they've maybe, you know, it'll lead them to other places and to find out more about things. So, and then they'll come back and see, yes, or and that I wanted to be asking questions more, you know, more than anything else. And so I came into it in quite a sort of conventional way in a sense, but then I mean there are various hints all the way through that things are not as you think they might be, and I can't give away too much, obviously. But by the end of the book, I think the characters are sort of reassessing their positions, and you know, I suppose processing it and working out what's what really in as much as you can do. But I think the really important thing really was